thank you to you all for your presentations, for your responses. I thought maybe since we sort of ended on the question of power, and we have 2 males on this end and 4 females on this end, it'd be a good way for you all to reflect, maybe Sarah, Madison, and Angela first, about this question of power. And someone had actually emailed or texted in essentially the question of if tech is, the promises of technology are such that they deliver life or they deliver freedom from oppression or these sort of things, but they are in fact also the very means by which oppression and poverty and injustice happen in the world. The question really is kind of how do we navigate that? So Ryan and I years ago were on a panel and we were doing stuff on tech that we called Google Maps on Romans roads. And my sort of analogy was the Apostle Paul leveraged technology, the written letter, to spread the gospel. And it wasn't just the letter, but it was a letter delivered along and through the postal service of the Roman Empire. And that was only made possible because of the vast expansion of the Roman road system. That was only possible because of what was called the Pax Romana. Well, the Pax, the peace of Rome, was only peaceful if you were Roman. So immediately you go, the very gospel message that we've received was doing this, leveraging a technology that was complicit in power that we would want to call out. So I say that to say, how do you think about whether it's your virtue development apps, whether it's your conversations with transhumanists, as how do you navigate those questions of power while acknowledging the technology themselves are both complicit in the power structures and that means to undermine them? And maybe, Sarah, do you want to go first, or should I say Angela go first? I don't want to put you on the spot.
I can take a shot first. I mean, okay. I think the problem is I don't have a very good answer for how to do that. Yeah. It's just a present reality that these are the tools we have. This is the world we have. Christ's kingdom is already, but it's not yet as well. But my approach is to say, how can we motivate, incentivize, and activate people who do want to provide virtue development to those who most need it, and not just to the privileged few? How do we help empower them to do that work? I think kind of with I talked about earlier, we're running these RFPs for developing products that help build virtue in adolescents. We also have an RFP, a call for proposals for teams of scholars and practitioners to build contextualized interventions in out-of-school activities and programs that really involve scholars and practitioners and the youth working together to think about what's needed. And really our intention there was also to focus on contexts that might be underserved. So ethnic minority communities or social service, foster youth or things like that, and say, right now a lot of our research and our best science is looking at privileged white kids, quite frankly, and saying that's not okay. Let's use our power structure of money and funding of grants to change what we decide is important and make people focus on things differently, because they will go where the money goes. And so that's one personal approach I've taken, but it's very difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. This is some of the most difficult work is figuring out this thing, okay, so technology is related to power. How do we address this? For me, the book Authentic Transformation by the late Glenn Stassen, beloved professor here, and John Howard Yoder and Yeager, they write about this in a way that I think is really helpful for thinking about technology. When they talk about in one section of the book, it talks about different ways that we can think about cultural phenomena. So we can reject certain cultural phenomena. And in my book, and Always On, I adopt it for technology, this sort of typology that they set up, which is, I said, Jesus, when we look at his life, sometimes he rejected technology outright, like the system of currency at the temple. He rejected it. Sometimes he used technology exactly how it was meant to be used. The scroll in the temple, he rolls it, depending on how you think about what happened in that moment, but he used scrolls, he used some certain technologies exactly how they were meant to be used. Other ones, like boats, he used in a way that they weren't intended to be used that way, but he used them for his own purposes because they weren't created with values and practices that thwarted his own aims. So boats, he preached from them because it was fine to use them in that way for that. Boats weren't meant to be preached from, but he used them because it was helpful, right? And it didn't thwart his aims of preaching. But then also Jesus transformed technology as well. Jesus transformed the cross from a technology of shame and murder to a technology of love. And so I think as Christians, when it comes to, honestly, so sometimes being sometimes thinking about power structures and media, sometimes it's just about being in a room of Christians in a church, and we are asking this question, okay, when it comes to this media platform, should our church reject it? Should we use it as it is? Should we use parts or aspects, certain design features of Instagram and not others? Should we transform this in some way? And then also, we could think about Andy Crouch and his thing about like creating and cultivating. How might Christians participate in the development and design of technology? And so in our church settings, when it comes to addressing power, I think it really is about critically reflecting and theologically reflecting on different forms of media that we use as a church. And it means asking questions like, who has access to this technology? And if we're going to use this technology in our community, we need to make sure that everyone has access to it and that we share devices or whatever it takes to make sure everyone has equal, that we're fairly giving access to this or whatever. And then finally, that's just, on the ground in a church room. We also need Christians, just like we said we need Christians at some point. Somebody decided we need Christians in LA. We need Christians that are making movies, that are writing great books, that are doing, working in the industry. We also need Christians who are working in Silicon Valley. We need Christians who are helping people, like companies, to think about how we're developing technology and how we're, And so I think being in the room with people who are developing technology, that's an incredible way to kind of get in the way of and to think, kind of be in the room with the people that are in power.
Madison, do you want to?
I was going to say that all of us, we all have our different roles that we play. This is an interdisciplinary panel, and we all make choices about the things that we do in our work. And so in our particular study, we made particular choices about the participants, the sample, the methodology, and probably in thinking about it, most of it was informed by researchers who were probably mostly white. There are quite a few women in psychology, so we were probably informed by that perspective. But I think the question is an important one because even our education and our backgrounds are constantly informing our choices. And so having a greater awareness of where those choices are coming from, I think would be helpful looking forward to creating these new technologies and including other perspectives and other types of people.
One thing, wherever the sort of power differential goes, and then thinking through the inverse of vulnerability of something that we suggest, one form of vulnerability that I was sort of noticing in all of your presentations responses is the vulnerability of the researcher or the scholar or the adult to invite the end user to participate in the creation of the thing. Right. So Susan's main question is, at what level were participants included in this? At what level are our church members? At what level are the people that we're ministering to, right? We tend to otherize so often from whatever our positions of power are. So maybe first, Sarah Madison, can you tell us a little bit, just in response to Susan's question of how that app was developed and what the sort of focus group was in terms of the bottom-up way that it came to be?
Yeah, I think I was like, I didn't give enough details. I normally go the opposite direction and give too many of the research details. We did quite a bit more iterative focus groups back and forth than I think I let on in the presentation. So, we did initial conversations about what's even desired by our end user, went and had conversations with adolescents, mostly in school contexts, sometimes in youth groups, but more in schools. And then kind of as we made different versions, we'd go back and do more focus groups and see how they interact with it, what do they think about it, and get their feedback and kind of ideas and so forth. And I think, and then through our actual kind of more formal data collection, we included a lot of questions, both kind of more multiple choice, but also some free response about what's the experience of using this app? What do you like about it? What don't you like about it? Is this something you'd want to use again? When? Why? And really trying to get more feedback about what that experience is like, what people see it useful for, right? That may or may not be what we see it useful for. And we hope, right? Money is really about a lot of this, right? And then funding runs out and you're like, okay, now it's time to iterate again. But we're stalled at that step. And so kind of that continued engagement, if we're able to move forward, will be really part of things.
Yeah, money is in play in all of these things, I think. It reminds me, oh, and by the way, I'm getting your questions. I'm trying to, hopefully you see them in these questions here. I'm trying to condense and collate. But one, so Matt Lumpkin was on an earlier panel who helped you design that, and then now was on our practitioner panel saying like, hey, I'm doing these sort of things. And his specific thing is, how do I have the end user be the one that dictates the terms of the development? And that raises all sorts of questions on funding and whatnot, because you're usually serving those who don't have the funds to resource the tech development, right? And so how do you work with industry and entrepreneurs and venture capitalists, or, as we saw from earlier presenters, the military often that wants to come in and do these things? So Susan, I wonder if you could maybe say, I was thinking specifically since you responded to the question of the Virtue app, I found really interesting the comment that, okay, so from what I understand sociologically, adolescents are the primary target for religious conversion, meaning there's more religious conversion during adolescent years than at any other time. Adult conversions are more rare. At the same time, it's really hard to develop and cultivate virtues among that same population. So Susan, you are also a parent of this age. What are the missiological implications of that? That on the one hand you have this time in which religious commitments are sort of animated, amplified, and yet there's that sort of inverse relation of it's really hard to cultivate what we would think of as virtues.
I have to answer a question that I have. I mean, like, tell me the answer. How do I do that with my adolescents? I think if I'm thinking missiologically about it in particular, and in light of some of the other things that were brought out in terms of vulnerability, in terms of the model of Jesus, if I go into the relationship with the adolescent, measuring their capability against mine, seeing their limitations, the limitation between the adolescent and the adult form, instead of standing with them where they are. I was thinking as I was writing my comments and thinking about Hebert and thinking about one of the critiques of intercultural missionaries is treating people like adolescents, right? That's happened a lot in mission, where we treat the folks we're going to as if they are children less than us, rather than full human beings capable of engaging and leading the way. And so I still want to advocate for that with adolescents. But in the sense your question is, I don't have a really good answer for that, because that's my struggle as a parent, is how do I live in this space of their full humanity and their limitations, and the fact that their prefrontal cortexes are really not developed. It's very obvious sometimes, but they are dynamic, full human beings.
Sarah, were you wanting to say?
Yeah, And I think it's interesting when we look at the developmental psychology research, one of the most important things is the formation of the adult who's in that relationship, right? Are you patient? Are you extending love and showing responsiveness, but also setting standards with yourself and with your adolescent? So I think there's really a lot of regulation during childhood and adolescence is co-regulation, right? It's not like the child is sitting there doing it alone. We are doing it. And I think that is true in adulthood as well, right? We regulate with other people. And so as we thought about different iterations of where to go from here with our app, one idea we had was maybe we don't even target to the teens and just do to the people who work with teens. Because if we can increase our patience and model that and be emotionally responsive and help cultivate that responsivity in ourselves, it will help to change where the adolescent's at. And so that's what I often talk about with parents is starting with yourself. If I lose my patience with my 3-year-old, that it's going down, right? This tantrum is going down. There goes an hour, right? It's really about the adult being able to cultivate in themselves.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I hadn't until just now you were talking about it, the parenting metaphor, but then the missiological that you do infantilize or treat as but then the same sort of principle of, I think what you and Madison were getting at the end of the day, in some ways, this is about us, not them. The sort of edict or emic view of this requires a transformation on my part in many ways. And my extension or invitation is for me to be transformed. And as a parent, yes, I'm always guilty of you need to watch your screen time, kids. And it's a bad modeling thing. A similar thing, maybe Wilmer and Angela, you can maybe both answer this. It's a little bit of a shift, but similar in terms of maybe it's modeling or language as people of faith inhabiting a very plural world. But a world that I find fascinating about Angela's conversation and even the other ones that were sort of high-level transhumanism, ultrahumanism, and what often we fail to realize is how much that is in play in all of these different modalities of life. So Iron Man is a good example, right? Marvel Cinematic Universe in terms of how it envisions the human or the superhuman, Superman. I mean, literally it's there. But down to our just immediate as a society saying yes to medical innovations that heal certain things with the assumption that longer life is always good. Full stop, right? So it's always in play, that sort of vision of life. But it implies this notion that death is solvable via technology. And at least for those of us on this panel right now, we confess to a faith based upon a crucified God that said the last enemy to be defeated is death. So my question is, if death is solvable technologically from a societal vision, how do we speak of death? How do we speak of what salvation is? From what are people delivered? Or is that even the wrong question now to be asking in light of transhumanism? I don't know if you want to start, and then Angela.
To be safe from ourselves, from our overwhelming pursuit for power, and we're power seekers. So there's no distinction in any language, any skin color. You go to the end of the South, global South, you'll find people oppressing others. So I think the work of salvation has to do with our dependency on what is suitable for us so that we can dominate. And I think Nietzsche has a lot of good ideas in terms of challenging our own understanding and illusions as the will to power. And as parent, I see him in parenthood. I have 4, and I have sometimes to give up my right to be right and say, you're right. And my son is looking at me like, what? Because he sees that I'm giving up something that I could, like you share. I appreciate that you share very openly about your story while waiting. because that shows that you're willing to come and say, I'll give it up. So, and I think that's innate for male and female, because I've seen that in my context in Latin America, the best teachers of machismo or male dominating are women who teach little boys, you never cry, you don't cry, you're a boy, go out and play. So those are things that are so embedded in our soul. And I think that's what we need to be safe from, because it transcends everything we do. I mean, I see it in ministry, I see it in pastoral work. And what it really hurts me, and part of my research is to see that asymmetry that it happens across the board. And it's because of power. And we need to be safe from that.
Yeah, I mean, we need to be saved from sin, from and from our inhumanity. We need to be saved from our desire to control other people, to oppress, to persecute. There's many forms of death. I mean, I think that's the big thing that transhumanists miss, right? There's not just physical death, but there's all sorts of death that when we think about Christian witness, I mean, sometimes there needs to be the death of pride, the death of entitlement, the death of, but also, so there's forms of death that I think that are solvable from a Christian perspective that need to be, but it's like forms of death that need to happen. And then there are just other forms of death that they're not acknowledging beyond physical death, like the death of relationship. There's the death of a dream, the death of vocation, right? These are forms of death that Christianity still also needs to address as well. So I just think, but transhumanists are asking us, is there more to your Christian faith than death and resurrection in the kind of way that, so in a vision of heaven? Is there more here? Because maybe if, and there are Christian transhumanists, I didn't bring them up in my lecture, but I talk about it in the chapter. There are Christian transhumanists who imagine that technology is the way that resurrection is going to happen. It just is going to happen in a way that we didn't imagine it until now. That's a whole nother conversation, whether or not, you want to get in that camp or anything like that. But I think, and I wonder about those Christian transhumanists really thinking more about how a vision of a transhumanist, like a transhumanist vision of a good life and a Christian vision of a good life, how well do they align? I mean, I think that's the question I'm asking this afternoon, and suggesting that there's a lot of ways where we might have common goals, but where we don't align, right? And so, but yeah, I think that there's multiple forms of death, and what we need to be freed from is absolutely from ourselves, from power, from sin, from our inhumanity.
Well, we could just keep going and going. Our time has come to a close. I want to thank you all for your vulnerability, for your willingness to call truth to power in and through the various ways that you do it, and for blessing me with a lot of things to think about, and some problems to solve in my own heart now that I will take away. So thank you all. Would you join me in giving them a hand?